So yeah, so this book in general is, of course, as the title suggests, about this concept of finalism, and this is sort of a central problem in like philosophy of biology or in understanding what exactly biologists are doing, particularly when they talk about something, some behavior or organ or structure or whatever having a function. So like there are some obvious examples. Wings are for flying, a heart is for pumping blood, etc. But trying to sort of explain what exactly we mean by that statement that this organ is for this function. In a maybe naive sort of biology, then you can sort of just take this as a intrinsic property of organisms. So maybe I think Aristotle's maybe not quite that naive, but in a sort of Aristotelian in a vague sense approach to biology, you could just say that organs just have a purpose, and they are. This is sort of like an intrinsic property of an organ is to have that purpose and to function in that way. But of course, in the sort of post-Darwinian world, or in general, a world that is suspicious of final causes, I guess since Galileo, more or less, in science in general, there's a lot of suspicion of the concept of final causes. It then becomes harder to explain what exactly a function is supposed to be. Like if everything is just matter in motion, then how do we explain what we're saying when we describe the heart as being for pumping blood? And Ruyer is basically going to reject that whole sort of suspicion. He's going to say that all these attempts to sort of explain away what finality is are failures. And as we saw in the first chapter, they in the end sort of run into a performative contradiction in the sense that by asserting something like there are no final causes, or there is no finality in the world. Various sort of not quite equivalent versions of this, but related versions of this. He's going to say that by asserting that, you are sort of the act of making that assertion contradicts the content of the assertion. And so like he's sort of modeling this argument off of an argument about freedom. And so if you, for example, assert that all human actions, or the whole universe is a deterministic system, everything is just the result of some sort of causal process, the act of making that assertion contradicts the content of the assertion, in the sense that this sort of deterministic causal process doesn't have a meaning. So it's just a sequence of mechanical causes and effects that are producing, say, sounds in the air or marks on a piece of paper or whatever, but that it doesn't have a meaning. And so just by virtue of expressing a proposition that has meaning, you are sort of presupposing that this sort of mechanical explanation of the world is not sufficient. And so this similar type of argument applies to other domains that have something to do with value or sense or norms, etc. And yeah, so that's sort of his general starting point for this book. And then in the chapter we're reading now, the second chapter the title is Description of Finalist Activity. And so he wants to look, in more, I guess, in more specifically, like what is it about concepts like value or purpose, freedom, sense, etc. What is it about these concepts that makes them have this kind of inescapability to them, in a sense that you by like in expressing a proposition that would deny the existence of something like sense, you are engaged in a performative contradiction. So which concepts have this property, and what is it about those concepts that has this, or that gives them this property? So we looked at a few of them, examples that he gave. So what was it? Freedom, existence here in the sense. So this is he's drawing on the cogito argument. What he describes as a work activity. So this is activity that is not just a sort of randomness. It's a directed activity or of some kind, or an activity that can be done in a better or worse way. So it has this sort of normative quality to it. Yeah, and so and then he gets to the concept of finality, which of course is one of these concepts, and then he's going to run through sort of a few different forms of that finality. And so I think we got to yeah. So sorry, he went through the three forms of finality, which were sorry, I guess the list here. Yeah, invention. Oh, sorry, no. Yeah, finality, invention, and value are the sort of three forms that he's talking about here. So yeah, he has these like six concepts that are he describes them as at one with the notion of sense, with the idea of sense. Anyway, so these are sort of like different instances of this sort of conceptual structure that has this sort of self-presupposing character, or this capacity, this sort of quality that makes it impossible to deny them without this sort of performative contradiction. Yeah, so we're going to go through, I guess, more explanation of what it is about these concepts that gives them this property as we go through this book. Okay, so we can leave that there and start from page 14. And I think we are at the paragraph here, if the numbered arrows. And so yeah, there's a reference to a diagram. So maybe we can start by just describing the diagram. If Angus, maybe if you could start there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this diagram is there's a sort of two-dimensional space-time plane with, I guess, these different moments that are supposed to represent the gestures of a traveler who is getting ready to, or I guess who is getting ready to, and then going through the process of traveling somewhere by train. And then above the plane is a kind of higher dimensional, I guess, bracket labeled finalist theme. So the idea is that there's this transspatial, transtemporal theme that spans all of these gestures and, surveys them, I guess, to use the word he likes to use. If the numbered arrows in space-time represent the gestures of a traveler who dresses, hurries to the station, buys a ticket, and boards the train, it is clear that the description of this movement, seen as a mere succession of causes and effects in spacetime, has to be completed with a description of the sense and end of the traveler's activity, sense and end that quote-unquote survey the unfolding of causes and effects and organize it into a signifying. In other words, all the notions we have described are characterized by a unitas multiplex, to borrow W. Stern's expression. If the multiplicity is quote-unquote realized, then unity has to be considered as quote-unquote surveying, surveillant. If not, then the unitas multiplex can be expressed with a single word, quote, form. Every activity, every conscious existence has a form, and each product of a finalist activity presents the observer with a complex structure. In the product structure, in contrast to the activity form, the multiplicity immanent to the form has been quote-unquote realized, as in a machine in which the pieces assembled by the engineer propel one another. We have not dwelt on sense itself. We consider it sufficiently illuminated by the analysis of notions that are at one with every attempt to define sense, which claims to supply the, quote, sense of sense, unquote, can only muddy the waters. Let us confine ourselves to stressing that sense is not signification in the etymological sense of the term, that is, the designation of a sense by a sign. The existence of signs and significations implies, in a different sense than the existence of machines, a striking dissociation of two planes, the plane of multiplicity on which signs exist in their physical succession, and the plane of the transcendent unity of the designated sense. Suppose X is speaking to me. I grasp or spontaneously search for the sense of his words, what he means to say. But if he acts without speaking, I have exactly the same attitude. I search for what he means to do. I have, again, an identical attitude before an animal, assuming I do not burden myself with behaviorist hypotheses. It matters little whether the action I witness has or has not, in addition to its proper intention as an action, a signifying intention toward me. Whether I grasp it or not, the sense of an activity is inherent to it, and does not depend on a witness. It is therefore a very lamentable error to define sense through the much more specific notion of signification. humans are so habituated to language, that is to quote unquote signified sense, that they easily doubt the sense of what does not speak, of what does not express itself through spoken or written words. They imagine that they give a sense to things by naming them. As I mentioned last time, this is comparing the sense of an action or a series of actions, the enveloping sense, I guess, to the sense of a proposition is. I find that a very clarifying comparison. None of the actions of the traveler, at least in the order in which they occur, make sense unless we consider the intention of the traveler to get ready, go to the station, buy a ticket, board the train, going somewhere. And then the point about non-linguistic sense in animals, I think Ruyer is pretty closely aligned here to Merleau-Ponty's arguments in structure of behavior, where Merleau-Ponty he argues basically that physiology is incomplete without considering psychology, so like the meaningful experience of the organism, and that's true for human animals and human beings alike. Although I think Ruyer will extend meaningful activity further than Merleau-Ponty does, at least in structure of behavior, to include some inorganic forms like molecules and atoms. Yeah, I guess. And then the last thing I wanted to note is this difference between the multiplicity and the form, I think, lets Ruyer distinguish between an activity that is sort of being actively surveyed by a sort of sense, or is carried out with a sense in mind, and then a form that was produced by purposeful activity but doesn't itself have a purpose, which would, I think, include machines in general. Ruyer.
Yeah, so I think when he talks about this sort of surveying, um, yeah, so this, I think maybe sometimes, well, sorry, there's a sort of difficulty with this maybe like psychological imagery, I guess, in the sense that when he's describing, say, the development of an organism, how the acorn becomes an oak tree in the sort of stock Aristotelian example. Of course, for Aristotle, this is sort of modeled on intentional behavior of a person, in the sense that the oak tree is directed, or sorry, the acorn is directed towards the oak tree in something like the way that the person building the house is like directed towards the end state of the house being built. But of course, the big sort of disanalogy here is that the acorn doesn't have sort of like an image of the oak tree in its acorn head. It's not like sort of picturing the desired end state and saying I want to become an oak tree, in the way that the person building the house likely does have some sort of explicit representation of what exactly they're trying to achieve. They have like a goal in mind that is sort of present to them. So in the case of the acorn developing into the oak tree, this sort of survey or this unity is not something that is present at any single point of the developmental process. It's sort of the overall pattern of that developmental process. Whereas in the case of the person building the house, I mean, you have something like a blueprint, for example, that sort of depicts it's a representation of the end state, and then the process of building the house is going to be guided to some extent, at least, by that representation. And so this is sort of the disanalogy. But yeah, it's hard sometimes to, I guess, hold on to both the sort of analogy between this sort of directed activity and like the development of the acorn into the oak tree, this analogy with a sort of goal directed behavior in a person, but also without sort of like slipping back into this presupposition that it has to be sort of directed towards a representation of that end state. And of course, yeah, so Ruyer is not sort of asserting that electrons, have a picture of, where they want to end up or something, or, oak acorns have a picture of an oak tree that they're, aiming, or a blueprint of an oak tree that they're aiming towards, etc. So it has to be a more, I guess, subtle or harder to grasp, I guess, idea of what we mean by directedness. But I think this sort of distinction between sense and signification maybe helps along this line, because so he's when he talks about signification here, he's using that term to like he's using that term in the sense of behavior of some kind that is intended to transmit information or to communicate with another person. So writing a letter, speaking to another person, et cetera, et cetera. These are all behaviors that have a communicative quality to them. But there are all sorts of other behaviors that we engage in that are not intended to communicate, but that are still senseful in a sort of a broader sense. That they're not just sort of physical events that happen in our bodies. They are things that we can do well or poorly, or that are morally good or bad to do, etc. And I think this so as we were going through this passage, something that came to mind in relation to this, sense, this sort of grasp of sense, and so the way Ruyer points out that we interpret behavior as having a sense, and not only when it's significative behavior like speaking or writing, but we just sort of spontaneously attribute a sense to people's actions. If you see someone put their hand on a doorknob and then turn the doorknob and then pull, and then the door opens, then you sort of like you immediately see the intention of the person to open the door. You don't just sort of watch their muscles contract in various ways. But an interesting example of this that was only found much later than he's writing is there's this experiment with, I think, very young infants. I think maybe even like the first few weeks of life, where so with very young infants, you can't like ask them questions about like what they're seeing, and the sort of standard way of getting around this in a lot of psychology work is they give them a pacifier with like a sort of sensor in it that sort of allows the experimenters to detect the rate of sucking on the pacifier, and the rate changes when something new or like interesting happens that they observe. So when something new happens, they start like sucking on the pacifier more quickly, and then if that new thing, if nothing sort of scary or exciting or whatever happens after that new event, they go back to sort of the normal rate after a little while. They get bored, and so this allows you to identify whether the infant has learned that, or whether the infant can detect a difference between situation A and situation B, or whether they sort of perceive something as new or unusual or whatever. And so one of these experiments involved like they watch a little scene where an adult sort of walks into a room with like a box in their hands or something like that, and then uses their head, I think, to like a light switch and turn on the lights. And so in this situation, like we, as an adult observer, you would say that, oh, the person has their hands full and they are, so they have to use some other body part to flick the light switch. And oh, actually, I think I might be mixing this up a little bit. But anyway, so basically the two conditions of the experiment are, the one case where the adult has their hands full and then uses their head to flick the light switch, and the observers sort of attribute the use of the head to the fact that the hands are full, and then so the using your head to flick the light switch is sort of like a sort of accidental feature of the experimental situation. But then the other version is where the adult walks into the room with nothing in their hands and still uses their head to flick the light switch. And in this case, the infants attribute the using the head to as like a sort of essential feature of this action, that like for whatever reason you have to use your head to flick this light switch. And so the observers are capable of grasping a sense to this action, like if the person has their hands full, then using your head is just a sort of convenient way of dealing with the fact that your hands are full. But then if your hands are not full, then there must be a reason that they are using their head to flick the switch and not their hands. There must be some sort of special head light switch or whatever. So here there's this like very sort of simple distinction, or this very simple sort of quality of a behavior, and then young infants are already able to sort of grasp, you know, the purpose or the sense of this like seemingly arbitrary action, or at least to attribute a sense to this action, just based on a very small, observation of a few seconds of behavior of a person that they've never met. So this is just sort of an example of how we are sort of like spontaneously inclined to attribute a sense to an action, even if we don't know what that sense is.
I feel like that last paragraph here where he says how we kind of we see the significance in language, and like what you were just saying, we might see some sense in this base behavior, but we have this tendency over time to kind of ignore that and miss the underlying sense in action. Like that's kind of what he's getting at the end here.
Yeah, so I think that last paragraph, he's maybe thinking of like a sort of more sophisticated, I guess, reaction to our like spontaneous tendency to attribute sense to behavior of various kinds. So this is like a sort of so like our tendency to attribute sense to actions is not infallible, of course. We sometimes we sort of overinterpret the sense of actions, or we are sort of like this happens quite regularly in, I guess, early studies of animal behavior, where um, people would describe an animal as engaging in some sort of sophisticated thought process, and then later studies were able to show that actually the animal was just sort of watching a very subtle cue that the human didn't detect, but that cue sort of allowed the animal to make an appropriate action, or to act in an appropriate way, but didn't require any sort of sophisticated thought process. And so that one example of this that we talked about in the Merleau-Ponty reading was this famous case of a horse named Clever Hans, who supposedly was able to do arithmetic. um, so you could say, what's 17 plus 22 or whatever, and then it would stamp its hoof the correct number of times to indicate the result of this addition. And apparently the owner was actually convinced that that the horse was doing arithmetic. It wasn't like a sort of deliberate fraud, but what was actually happening is that the horse was watching the owner, and so as the horse is stamping its hoof, it's sort of watching, and then when it reaches the right number, the owner's facial expression or body posture or something would change in a subtle way that without any sort of deliberate intention of giving a sign to the horse, but the horse observed this and then stopped at that right number. And so of course the horse is not doing arithmetic in its head. It's not adding these numbers. It's just watching the owner for this cue and then stopping. So yeah, this sort of the owner had this sort of spontaneous attribution of sense to what the horse is doing, and saying, oh, this horse is calculating the doing this addition, but actually the horse was just watching for this subtle cue. And this obviously this is a very sort of artificial example, but in many cases our sort of spontaneous attribution of sense to animals is maybe treating them as if they were doing the kinds of intellectual operations that we might do when they're actually just watching these subtle cues. And so the sort of reaction to that in like a sort of scientific attempt to understand animal behavior was to be very suspicious of attributions of sense. And the behaviorist sort of school or movement was like an extreme instance of this, and saying that we're going to eliminate sense altogether, and we're just going to talk about stimulus response and reinforcement and conditioning and so on. Um, and so that's the kind of thing he's talking about here in that last paragraph, saying that we it's this sort of denial that there is anything like sense in animal behavior. The only realm in which we will sort of allow that there is sense is when there's a signification that is being communicated. So spoken words or written words and so on. And so this, of course, is So it's certainly true that being careful about attributing sense to animal behavior is important in grasping what they're doing. Yeah, not assuming that horses are capable of doing addition is probably a good way of probably important in understanding how horses behave. But it also sort of limits our capacity to understand their behavior. There's actually in a completely different context. So something I was reading talking about animals' understanding of death, and there's a lot of debate about whether animals are really capable of understanding what it means for another animal to be dead. There there have been a few observations of animals in the wild or in like a zoo setting there where they do seem to be displaying something that we would describe as an awareness that their pack mate or whatever is dead. But yeah, you have to always be careful of I guess not attributing to the animal something that we would experience or understand in that situation. But it talks about how a lot of ethology or other studies of animal behavior has sort of been very wary of anthropomorphism, of sort of attributing human abilities or qualities to animals, where they aren't really present. But there's also a sort of opposite error or opposite danger of sort of denying certain qualities to animals because they exist in humans, and saying that that we can't assert that the animals know what it means for another animal to be dead, for example, just because they aren't human or something like that. So yeah, we can erroneously attribute sophisticated or senses to animal behavior, because that's what we would understand in that situation, or what the sense of our actions would be if we were doing the same thing in that situation. But we can also erroneously not attribute sense to an animal's behavior, just because we're sort of insisting on the difference, or on a sort of being extra careful not to commit an anthropomorphic error. So you can sort of go too far in either direction. But yeah, it's very difficult in general to be confident that we are attributing the right sense to an animal's behavior, like the sense that behavior has for the animal, and not just what the sense of that behavior would be for us if we were in that situation. Yeah, so the spontaneous grasp of the sense of behavior doesn't mean that we have this sort of immediate access to the correct sense of that behavior for that animal, especially the more that animal's sort of mode of life and sense organs, etc., are different from ours, the harder it is for us to be confident about that grasp of that sense.
Yeah, I guess for me, the way I'm understanding this is we tend to see sense only in our signifiers, and miss it everywhere else, like at the more fundamental levels.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe like the second order reaction. So our sort of spontaneous. So when you think about like small children are they very easily attribute sense to the pets that live in their house, or the squirrel that they see out the window, etc. They sort of watch their behavior and grasp them as engaging in purposeful activity, and they also often will attribute sense to their stuffed animals or toys or whatever. So they're sort of overextending it. And then this sort of second order, or the second level of sort of sense attribution, sort of recognizes the risk of over attributing sense to stuffed animals, or even live animals, attributing a kind of sense that isn't really there. That's just our sort of external attribution. So it recognizes that danger, and then sort of to avoid that danger, it sort of wants to lock down this notion of sense and only apply it in the sort of core case of humans who are communicating, either speaking or writing or whatever. So this is sort of like a second order reaction to our spontaneous tendency to attribute sense to many different things. So it's sort of like a bending the stick too far in the other direction, and so we have to sort of find a way of not overextending sense, and not assuming that the stuffed animal has purposes and so on, but also not restricting the notion of sense only to human communication. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit if someone could read. Yeah, so we'll start chapter 3, from the beginning of chapter 3.
Yeah, I can read this. Chapter 3, Finalist Activity and Organic Life. Can the quote-unquote I of the human that I am, the center of senseful activities, be isolated? Can it be posited in the void, a metaphysical foundling? And then these next two paragraphs are italicized. Historical reasons can help explain existentialism's systematic, or rather nonchalant, sidelining of the problem of organic life. As F. Bolno showed, existentialism is a radicalization of the philosophy of life, which is represented first and foremost by Dilthey. Interested particularly in the questions of philosophical method, Dilthey took quote-unquote life in a fairly vague sense, wavering between quote the life of the unthinking individual unquote and quote human life in general unquote. For him, life was the common source of heterogeneous theoretical, aesthetic, and religious activity, which can be understood as works of consciousness and not explained as things. Biology proper, whose method seems at first blush purely explanatory, did not interest him, and the material organism appeared to him more quote-unquote thing than quote-unquote mind. Existentialism rectified the vagueness of this notion by accepting and intensifying Dilthey's disassociation between the life of human consciousness and the organic life studied by biology. The human Dasein, a much more precise notion than quote-unquote human life, no longer has any conceivable connection to the human organism. Existentialism's violent and paradoxical originality stems in large part from this. It is very curious to note that there are similar historical reasons for Cartesian anti-vitalism and for the abrupt opposition it establishes between human thought and pure mechanism. The vitalism and the vague animism of the Renaissance barred the way to a clear and consistent philosophy. Cartesian doubt is directed precisely against these muddled doctrines. We have no reason to follow suit. We will not shut our eyes for the sake of philosophical purism to the fact that the senseful activity of humans stems from their organism. The correct way to avert the vagueness of a philosophy of life does not seem to lie in ignoring life purely and simply, or in interpreting it according to a more ambiguous dialect. On the contrary, we have to examine how senseful activity can emerge, not from quote-unquote life in the vague sense, but from the apparently material organism on which biology teaches us precise lessons. Can we stop there?
Sorry. Yeah, maybe we can stop here. Yeah, thanks. So here this question has to do with the relation between what we think of as more, I guess, specifically human sense. So when we think about linguistic meaning as one example, but also things like knowledge, freedom of action, artistic or aesthetic properties, and so on. All these more specifically human sense domains, and then life as a biological phenomenon. To what extent are these related to each other or distinct from each other? And so he points to the work of Dilthey, who is sort of whose work is not really studied that much anymore, but whose distinction between natural sciences and human sciences is still, I think, very influential. Or that he sort of captured at that moment in the late 19th century a kind of general presupposition that in human sciences, so in German Geisteswissenschaften, you are engaged in understanding. So if you are a classicist, reading ancient Greek text, you want to understand, the meaning of the text, of course, in the very literal sense, like what do these actual sentences mean, but also, what is the signification of this text, in the cultural context of, say, 4th century BC Athens. How does it relate to arguments of earlier and later philosophers? What sort of political tradition does it belong to, or is it a sort of pro-democratic or pro-aristocratic text, et cetera, et cetera. All these kinds of understanding questions that you can raise about a text. And then in the natural sciences, you are not engaged in understanding, but you're engaged in explanation. So you're finding a way of subsuming a certain event, a particular circumstance under a general law. And so this is Dilthey's sort of explanation of the distinction between Geisteswissenschaften, so human sciences, you could say, and then natural sciences. And something like this distinction, I think, is still probably sort of like the, I guess, common sense way of understanding the distinction. And we still in universities have separate faculties for, like, you might have a faculty of the arts, a faculty of social science, or sometimes arts and social sciences are together, and then natural science will be a separate domain, a separate faculty. So even at the sort of institutional level, there's this distinction between the people who study things that are to be explained, and then the people who study things that are to be understood. So he talks about existentialism here. He doesn't refer to any specific author, but he uses the term Dasein, and which of course is one of Heidegger's sort of keywords. And he asserts here that Dasein has no conceivable connection to the human organism. And so Heidegger's work in general, like in Being and Time, he explicitly sort of distinguishes what he's doing from a sort of biological understanding of a human being. And he says that we're basically like not interested in anything relating to biology. There is a lecture course from Heidegger where he does talk about biology. So he talks about animal behavior, and then he also talks about embryology in the sort of vitalist tradition. But it's I think that's probably the only place where he sort of displays any interest in biology. And he's in general very hostile to any sort of naturalistic approach to human life. The idea that you could sort of explain human existence in biological terms. And of course, for someone like Sartre, this would be even more sort of extreme. Has this notion of this sort of like absolute radical freedom of human consciousness as the for itself. That there's this sort of radical break between the realm of the in itself and the realm of the for itself. So it's Cartesian in the sense of this dualism. It makes this very strict distinction between the human realm and the rest of the world. And then of course, he is not going to follow along this line. He wants to understand when he wants to understand what the connection is between sense in the human domain and things like aesthetics, religion, philosophy, etc., literature, all these things, and sense in the biological realm. And he's going to, of course, take it that these are something like varieties of the same thing, that there is a sort of overall notion of sense that applies to both of these domains, or to all of these different domains. It's not just a sort of linguistic accident that we use the term life both for the biological processes that an organism engages in, and for like a biography of a person that has a sense. So we can't make this sort of strict distinction between explaining and understanding in the way that Dilthey would have wanted us to.
That's interesting. In light of like genetic phenomenology and Heidegger's like being historical thinking, the idea that there's a sort of non-empirical, I guess, history of the way being makes things show up in Heidegger's understanding of things. And Husserl's increasing interest in history and anthropology in his later work. And it does seem arbitrary, to exclude biology and the history of evolution from that kind of consideration as well. I know Ruyer is approaching this from a different angle and not doing genetic phenomenology, but I think that this question that he raises here at the beginning of the chapter could also be asked, I guess, of Husserl and Heidegger from within their own thought.
Yeah, so this, I think we can maybe, and again, like you said, this is not at all the way that Fourier is approaching this question, but we can maybe connect this with Quentin Meillassoux, like sort of famous arguments in his book After Finitude, where he talks about how in people like Heidegger and Husserl, you get these sort of when they sort of get to the question of what to do with statements about the earth or the universe before there were any human beings or even any living beings. If you assert that the earth is 4 billion years old, the universe is 13 or whatever billion years old, etc., you're making an assertion based of course on scientific evidence of various kinds. It's not just sort of an arbitrary assertion, but you're making an assertion about something that in principle could never have been observed by a subject, that it could not have been in the consciousness of a subject or in the world of Dasein or anything like that. And so how exactly do you make sense of this kind of statement in these sort of philosophical systems? And in many cases you get these sort of weird sort of kind of tortured assertions about what exactly these statements are sort of saying. And so like Heidegger in Being and Time talks about gravitation. He refers to Newton here, I think, rather than this is after Einstein had developed general relativity, so it's a little bit outdated at that point. But he says about how like Newton's laws as these sort of eternal laws, he asked the question, were they sort of true before Dasein existed? And he says something like, they sort of retroactively become like having been true when after Newton discovers them or something like that. And so it's this very sort of weird kind of tortured statement rather than being able to say, yes, these physical structures were there long before any person that had this sort of Dasein quality or nature existed to think about them or to discover them. And then of course, so the question that sort of comes up with these theories about maybe these sort of phenomenological theories or theories that sort of insist on the way that sense is related to human activity. The question that comes up, of course, is like when exactly this sort of emerges in the world. Like when was the do we find like the fossil of like the first Dasein in the ground, right? So like when did that emerge, right? And yeah, so for someone like Heidegger, this question is kind of like impossible to really deal with. That you could only say something like retroactively we can sort of like say that this fossil is like has become having been the first Dasein or something like that. We have to use these like elaborate sort of temporal loops to describe what exactly we're saying. And this obviously is pretty unsatisfying. To say that there's this important structure of certain entities that exist today. The other beings that we describe as Dasein. That and these beings that have this structure or this nature haven't always existed. It seems that we have to be able to say that at some point they emerged or they first appeared. And yeah, not being able to sort of say that in a clear and straightforward way is a weakness of that approach. And so that desire or that sort of weakness here certainly would give us motivation for trying to understand how life in the biological sense can develop into life in the sort of biographic sense. That's something that has a meaning in the sense of understanding in the way that Dilthey uses that term. It at least makes us want to have a way of understanding the connection between these two domains. So we can go on to the next bit. I can read this one. Okay. The man who speaks, heard by a friend or a psychiatrist, could not speak if he were a pure mind without a larynx or a tongue. Eddington insists that his final mathematical formulas are, quote, the work of a mind that respects truth and not of a hand that obeys Maxwell's equations, unquote. But he needs his hand to write. If there is a cognitive activity according to a sense and to an ideal norm, if the hand is guided in its movements by sense, thanks to cerebral links improvised by cognitive activity, the hand itself in its organic constitution and as a living organ also has a sense and had to be constituted in the first place according to a sense. The man who calculates and who, to spare himself the fatigue of mental arithmetic, prefers to resort to a calculator, avails himself of what other men built in view of such an economy. Thanks to the machine's gears or its quote-unquote mnemic recorders, he does not need to keep in his mind the digits he wants to manipulate. Thanks to the electric motor and the printing mechanisms, he does not need to use his hand to write. Tools and organs are interchangeable, vicarious. Both presuppose sense and finality as much in their construction and constitution as in their use. If it is absurd, as we have amply demonstrated, to deny sense in the human activity that seeks the true, or a political or economic output or an aesthetic effect, and leads to mathematical propositions, to calculators, to works of art, to well-adapted institutions, it is equally absurd to deny sense in the organic activity that constitutes the organs, because the organs conform to the same norms of utility and of aesthetic and technical productivity. It is even more absurd because it is through organs that man's finalist activity can build tools and other works of culture. But it is best to consider a simple and schematizable example. We borrow it from culinary art, which is in the end also a form of culture. Dilthey could have considered it in his review of the works of the mind, and it would have allowed him to escape every temptation to separate the life of the mind and the life of the body. Let us imagine a cook at work. Let us even represent him with a schema, figure 4, which I'll get to in a second, schema which we will make extremely rough to break the association of ideas. So figure 4 is that, yeah, as he says, is a very schematic diagram. So the cook is I don't even know what that's supposed to be. It's like an oval with like a semicircle at the top and some sort of, I don't know if that's like I don't even know what that's supposed to represent. It's just like a sort of pair of lines in the middle. And then there's a circle with a little sketch of a hand. And then there's another circle with a pot, and there are little arrows looping from the cook to the hand, and then back, and then from the hand to the pot and back. So yeah, it's very schematic. Okay, back to the text. His activity has a sense. He seeks to obtain the right result. He strives to follow the rules of the art, inventing new procedures at the risk of error. In short, the whole constellation of notions tied to sensible activity is present here, and the formula, quote, I cook, therefore I am, unquote, is a valid form of the cogito. The cook uses tools, casserole, spoon, that he wields with his organs, eye, hand, which are controlled by his central nervous system, and more particularly by the cerebral cortex. If we assume that he eats the meal he has prepared, we can say that a circuit is established that goes from his hand to the utensil, then to the gastrointestinal tract. The motor of this whole circuit lies in an organic need whose sense and end are clear, even though its modes of action are quite enigmatic. The complex modalities, the sophistications of culinary art, are introduced through the central nervous system, and this system is in a relation not only with the rest of the organism, but with a socio-historical culture and with a certain normative ideal, which cannot be represented on a geometric schema. If we now want to schematize digestion, the circuit will become internal. The movements and chemistry of the stomach are controlled by autonomous sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which are intimately tied to the central nervous system, especially through the hypothalamic region. The same holds for assimilation. Obviously, it is futile to establish a precise border between the internal circuit and the external circuit. The latter emerges from the former, complicates and prolongs it, and it is absurd to admit sense and finality for one and to deny them to the other. The cooking of food is a predigestion in the external circuit in the same way that digestion naturally continues the preparation and ingestion of food. So this I think is a really interesting example of how this sort of understanding versus explanation distinction, or the Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften distinction breaks down. Because cooking is, undeniably something that has a cultural significance for humans. It's something that we understand. There's certain food that is appropriate for a certain occasion, but not for another. There are things that you eat for breakfast, but not for dinner, or vice versa. There are, certain foods that are for special occasions, and others that are, everyday foods. And then, of course, there's, good and bad food. You can cook well or poorly, etc. So this is obviously something normative, something that has significance in the sense of value, or something that has this sort of very human appreciation to it. But on the other hand, of course, and the other thing to mention, of course, is that the significance or the sense of these different sort of food food types is very different across different cultures. So things that are considered delicacies in one culture might be disgusting to another one. Some types of food are, sort of things that are good to eat that are sort of considered edible in one culture and are considered not edible in another. The kinds of things you eat at breakfast in one culture might only be eaten at dinner for another, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it's not like sort of completely arbitrary. There's no. I think you can say with high degree of confidence that there's never been human culture in which granite was considered a staple food, or leaves of a tree were like a central element of the diet. There are certain properties that a substance has to have to be eaten edible in the very basic biological sense of like being able to be ingested without causing harm to the person. And then even within the domain of things that can be eaten in the sense that you can ingest it without harming yourself. It's not completely arbitrary, which of these things people will find appealing and which ones they will find disgusting. There's certain chemicals that humans, things like salt, sugar, and fat are things that humans in general like, of course, in the right quantities and proportions and so on. But food that doesn't have any of these chemical properties is generally not going to be considered tasty. So there are certain like biological properties, or there are certain chemical properties that a substance has to have to be sort of biologically acceptable in the first place, and then within that there are certain, I guess, tendencies that certain chemical compositions are more likely to be treated as good food versus disgusting food. So it's not, even though the food is a very sort of culturally specific sort of behavior of human beings, and there's a certain amount of variation between different cultures. It's not a sort of free domain of creativity in the sense that it's completely arbitrary. And so here we like to try to divide food or culinary behavior into like a biological domain and a sort of human social cultural domain. It would be extremely arbitrary. And then even at the very sort of basic level of like digestion, he points out, of course, that cooking food sort of performs similar sort of operations on that food as our digestive process does. It sort of helps to break down the food before we eat it. So if you think of like eating a raw carrot versus a carrot that's been in boiling water for 10 minutes, one is easier to digest than the other. And then especially if you think about like, I don't know, grains that like, rice, if you try to eat, raw rice, you will not have a good time in the succeeding hours and days. Whereas, of course, if you put the rice in boiling water and allow it to cook, then you can digest it much more easily. So yeah, here, of course, the sort of technical apparatus that we use for cooking, a pot and fire and so on, has a sense. A person has made this pot for the purpose of cooking. But what the cooking is doing is just sort of externalizing the kinds of things that our digestive apparatus do already. So if we are happy with attributing a sense to the technical apparatus, it seems arbitrary to sort of deny that the digestive system, the digestive apparatus that is doing the same kind of thing doesn't have a sense. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we stop here because I have to end a bit early today. This chapter, we can probably finish this chapter next time, I think. But yeah, we'll pick up from below the diagram next time. Thank you everyone for coming out, and sorry for some of the technical difficulties at the beginning. But hopefully my laptop will be able to find the Wi-Fi next time. And well, anyway, I have the phone set up now, so I have a backup that will work. Anyway, so thanks everyone, and see you next week.